So, Shon, to start today, here we are. We have Isaiah chapters 13 through 39. What would be the most significant mile markers or overview that people could keep in mind before we actually dive into chapter 13?
Okay, so, and I don't know if you want to put these chapters or not. So we've come out of the Syro-Ephraimite Wars, sort of this arc in 7 through 12 before we ever get to 13. Now we're in what is known, Syro-Ephraimite War. And then 13 through 23 are what are often called the oracles against the nation. So you have a series of prophecies.
That was 13 through
23 about a lot of different nations directed towards warning of impending destruction. And a lot of people, as they're reading these, they think, wow, these are so negative. And I would say Isaiah is, and there's so much that's merciful that encourages peoples to turn to the Lord. But Isaiah is a truth teller. These fit what is actually going to happen in history. So you could say, well, he's being negative, but the reality is this is really what's going on, right?
Yeah, difference between a pessimist and a realist.
Yeah.
He's not candy coating the reality.
Yeah, he's a truth teller. He's not a sayer of soothing things necessarily, although he does soothe, right, as he encourages people to turn to the Lord. Okay, so 13 through 23, prophecies of warnings to the nations. 24 through 27, we'll call the little apocalypse of Isaiah. So if you think of the book of Revelation, that's the apocalypse, the one that we're most familiar with. This is the little apocalypse. And apocalyptic literature generally focuses on end times, on sort of cataclysmic things but then that resolve with the triumph of God, the triumph of good over evil. So you get that in 24 through 27.
Which, by the way, is interesting because a lot of people see that word apocalypse and they think it's all bad. Yeah. It's all death and destruction and despair. When in reality, if God is going to come and restore his kingdom to the earth, that means many of the elements associated with the kingdom of the devil have to be overthrown first.
Yeah. And in fact, as is very appropriate for Isaiah, you get one chapter of negative, you might say, of warnings about things that are going to come, of truthful predictions and prophecies, and then 2 chapters of very comforting, look at the joy that comes. It might be like what to expect when you're expecting, saying, here's what you can expect as you're getting ready for the birth of this baby, and there's going to be some challenging things. You know, a man talking about this probably doesn't sound very helpful, but then the baby comes on the other side. There's life, there's joy, there's triumph, right? So
great example.
So 28 through 35, we're going to really generalize here with and it's another negative word, but the woe prophecies. And these focus on the failure of worldly kingdoms and worldly ideologies and how God's loyalty to God, loyalty to a covenantal relationship with God is going to triumph, is going to give greater stability, greater joy, because God is all-powerful, because God is constant and consistent. So then that brings us to 36 to 39, and if you are reading Isaiah straight through, this is like a breath of fresh air. These are the historical chapters, and you come to them and you're like, oh, this feels a little bit like I'm reading the Book of Mormon, right? Isaiah is highly poetic, as you know, and the prophecies are organized after the fact, and by the way, let's just come back here for a moment. 13 through 23, why are they organized the way they are? There's a debate about it. Some just think it starts in the easternmost kingdoms and then works westward and southernward. So it can be a little disconcerting as you're reading to say, what's the organizational pattern here? But this will just sort of give you, this really focuses on when Assyria comes against Jerusalem. And it's such a beautiful, powerful story, even though we're not going to really touch on it today. So.
Yeah. Which will then set the stage. You'll notice that 39, as we introduced last week, 39 is the end of kind of the first half of Isaiah, which is all of these consequences for what happens when people reject God, reject his laws, reject his prophets, do their own thing. And then 40 begins this merciful, comforting, hope-filled section of Isaiah, all the way through the end.
Yeah. Not to say there isn't comfort in the first half. These chapters you're familiar with because of the Book of Mormon are full of comfort as well, but then it shifts even warmer, so to speak, even more positive in the second half. And then one other thing I'll say really quickly, Tyler, is first half orients primarily to Assyria and to current needs. Second half points forward to future needs, although they're still relevant in Isaiah's day, and Babylon. Okay, Assyria, Babylon is sort of a generalized view.
So with that overview, let's jump in to chapter 13. So as we dive into chapter 13, keep in mind this is in the Book of Mormon as 2 Nephi chapter 23, and 14 is 24. So these two chapters referring to Babylon, they both show up in that big chunk that Nephi includes for us in his 2 Nephi account.
Can I say a quick word about that, Tyler? So I have in my office a book by a non-Latter-day Saint, highly reputable Bible study scholar who calls chapters 2 through 12 the little book of Isaiah. So it's the book of Isaiah within the book of Isaiah. Fascinating that then you say, well, why did Nephi pick this? Well, and it turns out to be the same chapters that this modern scholar said, there's a book within a book, and this is it. Now, Nephi does add these 2 additional chapters that sort of start the prophecies, and I think, and what we're going to talk about, is that there's a reason why, because it's theologically significant to him and to his father.
So let's jump in, chapter 13.
All right, so this is a really intriguing, this, and I don't know if you will or have discussed, I suspect you'll discuss it in other places, this idea of a prophet speaking about future things that can be applicable now. Many Bible study scholars will now look at this part and say, well, if he's focusing on Babylon, then this must, if it's not a major issue in Isaiah's day, then it must have been written afterwards in the time when Babylon is important. And so, and those of you who are listening probably have your own opinions. Latter-day Saints tend to not be overly bothered by the idea of prophets looking forward and speaking forward.
Yeah, and for me, I would say the prophet in the Book of Mormon who seems to like Isaiah the most, Nephi, he had his own little experience on a mountaintop, looking down the corridor of time forward and seeing Jerusalem and Mary and Jesus and his apostles and the crucifixion. And this idea of prophets, seers, and revelators not being bound by only telling the story of their own day, that doesn't seem to be an issue for many of us to say, absolutely, he could say very specific things about future events and still have it be relevant and applicable for the people in his own day.
There are tens of thousands of pages written on this, and it's not just about the view of prophecy. There's grammar and there's vocabulary and there's complicated things, but we won't delve into that right now. Exactly. Certainly, now we've got Isaiah talking about the overthrow of the prideful king of Babylon. And then there are these hints in the text that he's using that as a framework to talk about bigger things than that, right? He's talking not just about Babylon, but he's talking about the world in general. Look in chapter 13, verses 10 and 11, and all of a sudden this seems much larger than just talking about the overthrow of one nation. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened and is going forward. This is going to sound pretty familiar, this imagery, when you think about Matthew 24, which is Jesus's prophecy of the end times. And when you think about the book of Revelation, when you think about scriptures and doctrine and covenants, this idea of the sun being darkened, et cetera, et cetera. And then this is pretty fascinating, verse 11, I will punish the world for their evil and the wicked for their iniquity. So just a little Hebrew technical thing here, he does not use eretz or haaretz, the world, like a land or a specific entity. This is tevel. This is the world in general. And so many read this as then Isaiah using a historical incident or a big thing that's going to happen to then speak more broadly. And that prepares us for what happens in 13 and 14.
What I love about this context, Shon, is that if you consider the Babylonian, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, and the Canaanites, and other surrounding nations, they believe that the constellations, the sun, the moon, the stars, all represented different deities. Well, what do we get over and again, particularly in Isaiah, but throughout the Old Testament? There is only one God. It is Jehovah. It's Yahweh. And it's God showing that he has all power over the cosmos. So it's a very clear argument from Isaiah against all the other ideologies and religions in his time that the people are hoping and have expectations in gods that don't even exist. They think that the constellations are going to tell them how to order their lives. And ultimately, they're missing the fact, if they just pay attention, Isaiah's testifying God himself is in charge of the cosmos. Only one God, not a multiplicity. So definitely it deals with like the last days, the destruction, but also it's just this time of saying God is in the heavens and he is completely in control.
Which, by the way, is a message I think we need now, right? As you look at chaos and you think, wait, is God in charge or not? And Isaiah would reach out to our day and say, trust in the Lord. He's more powerful than the sun, than these, he's in charge of the heavens. He's in charge of technology, just to bring it into our modern day, right? The different things that we rely on to get our sort of sense of peace and security.
Which, by the way, is a really powerful reminder to us that if you take the Matthew 24 or the Joseph Smith Matthew, these prophecies that Jesus gave his disciples of the latter days, as well as the destruction in his own day from the Romans in 70 AD, if you look at all of these terrible things that he's telling us are going to happen, his whole point was, I'm telling you this so that you, my disciples, won't be afraid, so that you'll stand in holy places and be not moved, and so that you'll see as these things unfold. I told you they were going to unfold. It will be this sign that, hey, we are moving right along as planned. In other words, God isn't up in his heavens wringing his hands saying, oh no, look what just happened. What are we going to do now? This is all prophesied, so that when you see some of the scarier aspects of these prophecies, for instance, look at verse 6 and 7. Howl ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. Therefore shall all hands be faint, and every man's heart shall melt. This fear and melting and sorrow and travail doesn't need to permeate your heart as a disciple of Christ. If you stand in holy places, you look to the God of Israel, not to the gods of the world, whether it be technology or money or power, prestige, whatever this world has to offer, then we really don't have to be petrified or scared as we move forward. We can quietly, confidently increase our faith in Christ when we see these prophecies being fulfilled.
Well, these two themes, these are going to permeate the entire reading section. I mean, we'll be hitting these the rest of the time.
So before we jump into chapter 14, I think it would be worth noting the irony of Isaiah's prophecies regarding Babylon, this huge world empire. At that time, when Babylon is in its heyday, they are incredibly powerful. And the capital city of Babylon, it's one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, as Shon was mentioning earlier. These people are incredible builders, and their empire is enormous. And how big is Jerusalem, where Isaiah is writing these prophecies from? If you were to do just a size comparison between Babylon, the capital city, and Jerusalem.
It's laughable, right? It's so insignificant. And we see this happen so often. And it's a great point. It happens in Jesus's day. It's still the same story.
Who could come out of Nazareth? Anything good?
That's right. And you look and you're like, wait, this is not reasonable. Why would I believe in this thing when my eyes are telling me nothing conquers the might of Babylonia? It just doesn't happen. This is just a quick historical note. Neo-Babylon, for the historians who are sort of following along. Neo-Assyria, Neo-Babylon. If you want to sort of look it up, that's sort of what you'll see there.
Yeah, so it's basically this little teeny provincial capital over there, Jerusalem, is making fun of this world. It's a David and Goliath story times 10.
There's going to be this moment in Isaiah 37, and we won't jump forward there. It's in this reading block where the Assyria has come, And Isaiah gives Hezekiah comfort. Hezekiah runs to the temple. He sends his servants to the prophets. What more Latter-day Saint story do you have than that? That he goes to the temple and he prays directly to God in the temple, and then the answer comes from the words of a prophet. I love it. But the irony says, the virgin daughter of Jerusalem tosses her head at you, O Assyria, right? And so you sort of picture in our sort of modern time, sort of a teenage girl, right? Sort of, tossing her head at this mighty empire of Babylon. And this
In that
is
case,
Assyria
it's
in that
Assyria,
case,
but
right? And that imagery is so powerful, but we get so afraid. No, how can we stand here? It's really great. Isaiah does so many powerful things.
And the irony with Isaiah is he doesn't just taunt Babylon in this instance, but for the rest of all time moving forward. I mean, you look at verse 19, and Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees' excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation. That's a pretty serious indictment against this world's capital.
And it's been true, right? It's a mound, as is true of many ancient worlds. And this is part of the fascinating thing, is that the covenantal promises regarding the house of Israel, this doesn't happen where you have an ancient people that is overthrown and then in the latter days still exists. And then, of course, according to beliefs of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that it springs up out of the dust, the house of Israel does, and you have all these latter-day Israelites, so to speak.
Which, by the way, isn't this fun? We're talking about these historical cities and these historical people, and Isaiah speaking from the Lord's inspiration and declaring these things that absolutely have come to pass. Isn't this fun? The reality is none of this really matters, other than we can become experts in ancient Near Eastern history. But when it really starts to matter is when you say, what is the Babylon, or what is the Assyria today? Because it's not that location. It's anything that would set itself up to replace in our mind and in our heart the foremost position that belongs to God. Anything that would take our devotion, our consecrated efforts, anything other than God could be a Babylon. And in the end, all of those things will fall and crumble and be brought low and will never be inhabited in the eternities. They're very, very fleeting elements of mortality. And so as we now jump into chapter 14, just keep that on the forefront of, this isn't just a history lesson. Isaiah is not just about history. Isaiah is about likening all scriptures to us. So keep figuring out where you are in these stories.
There's an image earlier on in chapters 1 through 12 where King Ahaz is terrified of the threat of Ephraim, of Israel, the kingdom of Israel and Syria. And Isaiah calls them smoking firebrands. They're putting out so much smoke. It's so threatening looking, but they're not producing any heat. They're about to go out, but there's no way you can survive this. And he's like, nope, this is a smoking firebrand. And I found that image so useful in my life and the life of many students, where they'll say, wow, that image sticks, right? Whether it's a final exam, whether it's a business deal gone awry, whether it's an argument in a marriage, and it seems like, oh, I'll never recover. It's all over. And then through the atonement of Jesus Christ, it's a smoking firebrand. Hang in there. Things will be okay.
I love that.